Good morning, everyone. My name is Jerrimei Delantero from BEED 2D. I'm Group 3 and I'm going to discuss to you about Chicago Aristotelianism. Chicago Aristotelians criticism had its origin in the work of a group of critics based at the University of Chicago, of whom the most important was R.S. Crane, and the others were W.R. Keys, Richard McKeown, and Elder Olson. They constituted an important opposing force to the new criticism which had become dominant in American universities. From the 1940s, the Chicago critics were sympathetic to historical scholarship, but unlike most traditional historical critics, they were also concerned with the need for literary criticism to develop a coherent theoretical basis. They argued that the kind of formalist approach favored by the early new critics was inadequate because it failed to take account of traditional poetics. They particularly stressed the importance of Aristotle's poetics since it was fundamental to literary studies, that one should distinguish between different types of literary discourse and not treat them as if they had been constructed on identical principles. In the essay reprinted here, Crane attacks the priorism of the new criticism and argues that any valid criticism needs to combine historical scholarship, evidential reasoning, and practical experience in writing. Next, Wayne C. Butch. Wayne Clayson Butch was an American literary critic. He was the George M. Pullman Distinguished Service Professor Emeritus in English Language and Literature in the College of University of Chicago. His work followed largely from the Chicago School of Literary Criticism. Wayne C. Butch is probably the most important more recent theorist to have been strongly influenced by the Chicago School. The Rhetoric of Fiction. Rhetoric of Fiction is the major work of Wayne C. Butch. He criticizes the application of prescriptive critical assumptions to the study of fiction. He also uses the term rhetoric. He uses the term rhetoric not in the classical sense of persuasion, but rather in the sense of those techniques and devices an author uses to enable his work to communicate in the way he wishes to be or to the reader. In the extract reprinted here, Butch implicitly attacks new critical assumption by rejecting the arguments that it is only by dissociating oneself from one's own beliefs and viewing a work impersonally and objectively that one can have an authentic artistic response. R.S. Crane criticism as inquiry or the perils of the high priori road. This is about the limitation of the older literary studies were real enough. The great historical scholars of the last age. In this criticism, the age of Gasto, Parish, Bedier, Lanson, W.P. Kerr, Grierson, Kittredge, Manley, and Lewis. They say that the first that their criticism was in the main notably inferior in rigor and sophistication to their philology and history. And second, that the problem which most excited them and to which their techniques were best suited were problems that returned rather on the material contents and the historical circumstances of literary works than on their distinctive character as work of art. It happens that we have become more concerned than these scholars were about questions of the latter sort. That is why we have gone in so generally for criticism. But the burden of proof is surely on those advocates of criticism who would minimize the importance, even for their own studies, of the problem with which the older scholars mainly occupy themselves. My first complaint, then, against the person most actively concerned in the revival of criticism in the universities is that many of them have done criticism, as well as historical scholarship, a bad service by continuing to talk in terms of the antithesis between the two, which perhaps had some rhetorical or political justification 2 decades ago, but surely no other justification then or since. There can be no adequate criticism that is not solidly based on the history of the art with which it is concerned. But I do not want to dwell any longer on this first aspect of the critical revolt against the older literary learning. For something much more seriously troubling to me than this has been happening at the same time, the effects of which show no sign of disappearing. I mean the emerge within criticism itself of modes of thinking about literature which make not merely for a separation in practice between critical discussion and historical scholarship, but for a sharp and irreconcilable opposition in principle between the two fields. R.S. Crane criticism as inquiry or the parish of the high priori road is about granting the parish of the high priori road. It seems to me a sweeping misrepresentation of what many of these critics are trying to do. I haven't checked out their dogma lately, but I don't recall that the best of them are under any illusion that they are saying the last word on their subject. Yet, here and everywhere, Crane assumes, and I think in a very priori way, that any critic who departs from anything resembling a general principle or dialectic, has arrived at it almost by whim, or at least by inadequate examination of his text, and that he wants everyone else to employ his dialectic as a definitive tool for poetic analysis. In Crane's view, all these critics were blinders by virtue of having a special order of cause or theory, which they will habitually invoke to the exclusion of others. On hypothesis in historical criticism, they simply don't see the whole picture, and as a consequence, they see no true picture. Thus, the Freudian critic, who gets only dream structures out of novel in falsifying them. The archetypal critic, who gets only mythic structure out of poems, is falsifying them, and so on, in the very act of formulating and justifying his conclusions. Not once, in my recollection, does Crane suggest that there can be value or methodological integrity in concentrating a great deal of intellectual force on one narrow point. I think he is far more liberal than he argues, but in order to argue persuasively, he must subsume all attempts to locate general principles under his derogatory headings. Otherwise, he is simply combating individual abuses in a practice which might not be so bad in itself. Crane has a certain admiration for many of these critics, especially Lovejoy, but he always put their left foot forward, and his tone is ironical flat. When he comes to discuss his ideal historian of forms, however, his total critic historian, the argumentative procedure changes abruptly. It is like coming off a bumpy country road onto the turnpike. Crane and his company, they encourage to set up a critics by forcing them constantly to justify what they say in criticism and to explain how they know, from something other than current theory, that what they say of particular works is true. By subjecting bad method in criticism to a severe rebuke, as we give to bad method in bibliography and literary history, by trying to develop gradually a body of general knowledge of literature. A little now, more perhaps tomorrow, that is grounded in literary history and practical experience of writing instead of in dialectic merely, and by inculcating finally in our teaching and practice an exploratory and inquiring rather than a doctrinaire use of such knowledge in studies of particular works and writers, on the model of the other scholars rather than the new criticism. If you want further reading of this criticism, you can check the book of 20th century literary theory. In this page, Chicago Aristotelianism, page 57. And for that, thank you for listening and viewing this PowerPoint screen recording. Good day, everyone. Thank you.